Diablo first hit PCs more than a quarter century ago, and it has since become one of those rare franchises that just doesn't seem to get old. From its gameplay to its art style, it's remained incredibly consistent throughout the years, but the latest installment, Diablo 4, isn't afraid to try a few new things. For example, while it may not push the envelope from a technical standpoint, it makes use of things like PBR materials to give it a more grounded appearance. What really sets Diablo 4 apart from past entries, however, is the fact that it was a multi-platform release on day one, and given how PC ports have fared lately, it wouldn't be unreasonable to be wary of its quality. So, how did the PC version turn out? Does the franchise ascend to new heights, or should all who enter abandon hope? Let's find out. One of the first things to note before even purchasing Diablo 4 is that, like a number of other PC games today, it requires a launcher not called Steam. Whether you call it Battle.net or Battle.net, just know that you're going to have it installed, and also be willing to create an account. Also know that, though you can take on the adventure alone, an internet connection is required. In fact, you can't even start the game while offline. I realize this is old news to franchise veterans, but newcomers deserve a heads up. Upon starting the game, you're greeted with a slew of accessibility options, including everything from font size to text-to-speech and more, which is honestly great to see. Kudos to Blizzard. From there, first impressions remain rather positive as the menus thankfully have proper support for both keyboard and mouse and controllers, which actually turns out to be a great way to play the game in general. Moving over to the graphics tab reveals a plethora of things to tweak, which we'll come back to later. Also present are the usual things you'd expect, like the ability to customize controls, tweak audio settings and the like, and for those curious, it does have native ultra-wide support, but there is no proper full screen mode, which means in order to change your in-game resolution, you have to change the resolution of your entire desktop. Kind of annoying. In typical Blizzard fashion, the game opens with a CG cutscene. Not only is the video low in bitrate, but it strangely plays at 24 frames per second, and with poor frame pacing to boot. Now, I know 120Hz displays are much more common now than ever, but it's still an odd decision, made even odder by the fact that the game's real-time cutscenes are capped at 30 FPS by default via a limiter that can be toggled off in the menu. Moving on, let's talk about performance. It's no secret that Blizzard has traditionally designed its games to deliver a good experience across a wide range of PC hardware. I can confirm that that is possible to do with Diablo 4, but it's also possible to have a really bad time too if you're not careful. To demonstrate what I mean, let's take a look at raw performance on a higher end machine. As you can see, a 13700K paired with an RTX 4080 often hits over 100 FPS maxed out at native 4K, and turning on DLSS can boost that number to well over 200. Well, DLSS 2 can anyway, as there seems to be an odd bug with frame generation at the moment that actually causes the frame rate to drop when using anything except DLAA. Hopefully that gets addressed in a future patch. The game can be quite performant on much older hardware too. On a 3770K paired with a 6GB GTX 1060, I found that while 4K and 1440p were largely out of the question, it was indeed very possible to get a solid experience while making very few sacrifices at 1080p. And this is where things take a familiar turn, as maintaining a smooth experience largely comes down to the texture quality you choose and VRAM. Wait, what's this? Here in the menu, it claims that smoothness depends on your system memory and not VRAM? Well, before tackling that claim, let's take a second to look at our choices. In the graphics menu, we see 4 different texture settings ranging from low to ultra, and side-by-side comparisons reveal there could be a massive difference between each. This can be especially noticeable in lighter areas, such as here, where even on high, the stones are lacking fine detail at standard camera height, and medium and low are just downright blurry. Or here, where the cross in the middle of the floor is starting to show some pixelation at high, again becoming a blurry mess by the time it hits low. Now, to test their claim of smoothness being tied to system RAM, I simply ran around one of these towns in an easily repeatable manner several times on 2 different machines. First a few times with 32 gigs of RAM installed, and a few more with just 16. First up, with max settings at native 4K on my rig with a 13700K and 4080, it was incredibly smooth from start to finish every time with both 32 and 16 gigs installed. Next, I tried this test with 32 gigs of RAM on my mid-range rig with an R5 3600 and 2080, and this time performance was truly awful. One frame time spike even hit 500 milliseconds. Trying again with 16 gigs of RAM also performed largely the same. In other words, dropping from 32 gigs to 16 gigs of system RAM made no discernible difference in performance while using ultra quality textures on either machine. In fact, it never even came close to using 32 gigs of RAM. Having seen this then, I decided to see if the problem may actually be VRAM related instead. Now, I only had GPUs with 16, 8, and 6 gigs of VRAM on hand to test, but in short, the 16 gig card was the only one that exhibited zero problems while using ultra textures, especially at 4K. When tried on an RTX 2080, an 8 gig card, even with DLSS set to performance, I saw stuttering at 4K. Looking at usage data shows close to 15 gigs being used on the 4080, and nearly all 8 being used on the 2080 with ultra textures. Now, I can't say for certain if this is simply space being allocated or actual usage, but they're clearly very VRAM dependent, as the only way to reliably mitigate stutter was to turn them down to high and enable DLSS. Making this issue even worse is the fact that even the PS5's textures are a match for the PC's ultra setting, as we can see in these comparisons. This means that, ignoring its lower rendering resolution, people playing on PS5 are arguably getting a less compromised experience, since texture quality has such a significant impact on the game's overall appearance. On another note, I was able to determine that SSAO appears to be off on the PS5, but I'll be honest, I had a hard time nailing down what other settings were being used on the console. Looking at the graphics options themselves, on the plus side there are a number of things to tweak, which is great. These include DLSS and FSR, but strangely, rather than letting you choose whichever you'd like, you're only shown one at a time. So in other words, if you're using a DLSS capable card, then DLSS will be the only one selectable. If you're using a card that doesn't support DLSS, FSR shows up instead, and so on. I assume this was done to make things simpler for less informed players, but I'd prefer the ability to make the choice myself. Still, the most important thing is that they are present. Overall, I'd say the menu is a mixed bag, and it could really use some preview images, VRAM usage stats, and the like to help give a better idea of which settings do what. And it doesn't help that some of these descriptions seem to be inaccurate, like the one next to textures, which, based on my testing, should probably denote VRAM instead of system RAM. Also, for those curious about load times, using an average speed PCIe Gen 3 NVMe drive, say that 3 times fast, it took just over 8 seconds to get into the game from the main menu, and just over 5 to fast travel. Your mileage may vary, of course, based on your system specs. To round out this video, I think it would be good to take a couple of minutes to look at what some of the graphical settings do and their performance cost. Luckily, based on my findings, you shouldn't have to do much tweaking, as aside from the textures, the game actually scales incredibly well. In fact, aside from the obvious suggestions like turning on DLSS, there's 2 settings I tried turning down from the Ultra preset if you want some decent gains with a minor impact to visuals. The easiest one to justify first is SSAO, because Diablo 4 is often so dark and the camera is so far away that it can be hard to find a meaningful visual impact. But the performance hit is undeniable. Just knocking this down from high to medium, I saw a performance gain of roughly 12%. The second setting to try turning down is shadow quality. Going from highest to high can yield a 5.5% improvement without losing too much in the way of fidelity. And lastly, in case I haven't made it clear by now, unless you have a card with a lot of VRAM, you'll need to set textures to high, turn on DLSS or FSR, or maybe even drop resolution to get a smooth experience. Here are the settings I settled on to get solid performance on several different machines. And here are most of the rest of the settings to give you a better sense of what they do, and their hit to performance. Clutter controls things like the thickness of grass. Turning this off completely can provide a potential boost of up to 20%, but it really hurts the aesthetic of the game in my opinion. Screen space reflections is another expensive one with a potential 16% performance increase when off. This controls reflections on things like water. Dynamic shadows are another relatively expensive option, potentially providing a 7% boost when off. These are used extensively throughout dungeons. Geometric complexity controls the distance at which meshes lose detail and nets just a 3% uptick from high to low. Fog controls the thickness and quality of fog, mostly in swampy areas. Going from high to low netted just a 2% performance increase. Soft shadows attempts to make shadows appear more realistic. In actuality, it doesn't do much, and I saw an FPS increase of just over 1% with it off. Reflections control the accuracy of the reflections throughout the game. Going from high to low saw no performance gain. Water simulation quality changes how detailed the water is. Going from high to low saw no performance gain here either. Terrain geometry detail controls the amount of detail used to render terrain meshes. Another one with no performance hit. Shader quality has zero performance impact either, but it's hard to say exactly what this one does. In fact, the menu description is one of the most vague ones I've ever seen. It says it controls the quality of various visual effects on a case-by-case basis. You don't say. A couple of other quick things worth mentioning. I wanted to check for shader compilation stutter since I saw some people mentioning it online, so I did a clean driver install and ran through the beginning of the game twice. The results were a little surprising. One of the opening cutscenes is rendered in real time, and with the 30 FPS cap removed on my mid-range PC, it performed nearly identically on both runs, complete with frame rate dips and erratic frame times in the same places, and even hitches on the same camera cuts. Once I got to actual gameplay, I finally saw an instance of shader compilation stutter the very first time I attacked, but then when other things happened where I expected more hitching, there was nothing. So in short, yes, shader compilation stutter appears to be present, but very minor in my experience. One other notable thing that popped up a couple of times on my different PCs were these huge drops in performance that look really similar to the 500 millisecond frame time spike from earlier. Only these would happen for no apparent reason. Now, I've seen some discussion that this may actually be a network issue and that changing this Windows setting from private to public may solve it. Unfortunately, this is one of those things where I just can't say for certain, because I wasn't able to reliably reproduce it myself, and it only happened a couple of times across several hours of play. Overall, Diablo 4 on PC can be the definitive way to experience the game, provided your hardware is up to snuff. It is very possible to get solid performance across multiple generations of hardware, and the game offers a ton of options to not only help it run well, but also make it accessible to a whole host of newcomers. Now, we've seen other recent games improve the quality of their medium and high textures in patches, so it would be great to see the same happen here. But in the here and now, I'd say the PC version is still worth looking into if you're at all on the fence. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and don't forget to ring the bell to receive instant notifications whenever a new video drops. For a pristine version of this and every video we make, check out the Digital Foundry Patreon at patreon.com. And if you'd like to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. Till next time.